Norway House, Manitoba, a riverbank at the edge of the boreal forest, September 30th, 1907. An old man walked away from where the other prisoners were building their morning fires, found a tree at the edge of the bush, tied his own sash around a branch, looped the other end around his neck, and died. He was somewhere between 67 and 87 years old, depending on which record you consult, because the Canadian government had only recently become interested in counting people like him. His name was Zawuno Gejigo Galbo, in English roughly, he who stands in the southern sky. The Mounties who arrested him called him Jack Fiddler, which was easier to write in their reports. He had been in custody for over 100 days at the time of his death, awaiting trial for murder. He had never denied committing the killing. What he denied, right up until the morning he walked into the trees, was that what he had done constituted a crime. The woman he killed was the 14th person he had executed under those circumstances. Not the first, the 14th. And in all the years before 1907, no authority had come to stop him, because no authority had ever reached the place where he lived, the boreal forest of northwestern Ontario, along the upper Severn River, in a region so remote that for most of his life, Jack Fiddler's people had never seen a white man. He had spent decades killing something the Canadian government insisted did not exist. The government called it murder. His clan called it survival. The records of the Hudson's Bay Company, the journals of Jesuit missionaries dating back to 1636, and the clinical literature of early 20th century psychiatry all suggest, in their different ways, that something was happening in those forests that none of those institutions fully understood. The thing Jack Fiddler spent his life hunting is called the Wendigo. And before we get to the riverbank in Norway House, we need to understand what the Cree knew about the forest that produced it, because their understanding of what lives in the boreal winter is not backdrop to this story. It is the oldest version of it. The boreal forest of Canada is the largest terrestrial biome on Earth. 1.4 billion acres of spruce, fir, pine, and tamarack stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, dipping down through the northern edges of the Great Lakes and pressing hard against the Arctic tundra. It is not a dramatic landscape. There are no peaks, no canyons, no geological features that announce themselves. It is simply trees in every direction for distances that stop making intuitive sense after the first 100 miles. Northwestern Ontario, where Jack Fiddler's clan lived along Sandy Lake and the upper reaches of the Severn River, sits near the center of this forest. The winters there last between 5 and 6 months. Temperatures regularly fall to -40 degrees Celsius, a number that stops being a temperature and starts being a condition. The ice on the lakes doesn't fully melt until May. The ice comes back in October. Between those months, the region is briefly and intensely alive. Outside of them, it belongs to cold. The 5 clans of the Sandy Lake region, the suckers, pelicans, cranes, caribou, and sturgeons, had organized their entire existence around the rhythms of that cold for thousands of years. The knowledge required to survive in this forest is specific and non-transferable. How to read ice, how to cache meat, how to navigate without landmarks, how to stay warm when staying warm is a full-time project. These were not general wilderness skills. They were a precision adaptation to a single merciless environment. And the Hudson's Bay Company spent most of the 18th and 19th centuries systematically depleting that environment of the animals the clans needed to eat. By the time Jack Fiddler was a young man, the Sandy Lake region had been through multiple generations of endemic starvation. The fur trade had gutted the beaver and marten populations. The caribou routes were disrupted. The HBC, which held a legal monopoly on the region's trade and effectively controlled what food came in and what came out, repeatedly declined to acknowledge that the clans were in serious trouble. People in the Sucker clan starved regularly, not occasionally, regularly. Over enough winters, that kind of scarcity changes what a community fears most. What the Cree feared most by the time the written record begins to document their traditions was not the cold, not the animals, not enemy clans. It was something that happened inside a person. Something the cold and the hunger and the isolation could unlock. Something that, once it started, Nothing could stop except death. They had a name for it long before anyone came to write it down. The modern image of the Wendigo needs to be corrected before anything else, because what most people carry in their heads is a fabrication. The towering skeletal figure with a deer skull for a face and a crown of elk antlers, that image appears in no Ojibwe oral tradition, no Cree account, no Anishinaabe source of any kind. It was invented in the 20th century, popularized by horror fiction and video games, and it has almost no relationship to what the tradition actually describes. The Cree call it Witiko. The Ojibwe say Wendigo. The Abenaki have a related spirit called Kiwakwa. These variations belong to a family of Algonquian-speaking peoples spread across the boreal region, and their accounts share a core that is consistent enough to be treated as a single tradition with local dialects. The name, loosely translated, means something like evil spirit that devours mankind, but the translation loses what matters most about the concept. The Witiko is not a creature that attacks from outside. It is a transformation that happens inside. In the Cree understanding, the Witiko is a manito, a spirit that exists within the natural world and can enter a person. What makes it distinct from other possessing spirits is what it does once inside. It replaces human hunger with something that ordinary hunger cannot satisfy. The possessed person begins to crave human flesh, not metaphorically, not symbolically. They crave it the way a starving person craves food, with the same desperation, the same physical urgency, the same inability to think about anything else. And unlike ordinary hunger, this one grows with consumption. Eating does not end the need, it amplifies it. The tradition describes early signs: withdrawal from the community, disturbed sleep, the refusal of available food, a persistent and deepening nausea at the sight of ordinary meat. These symptoms, in a community that has already been through seasons of starvation, were terrifying in a specific way, because a person in this state, if left untreated, would eventually become capable of killing other people to feed the thing inside them.
The first written documentation of this phenomenon comes from 1636, when Jesuit missionary Paul Lejeune recorded accounts of what the indigenous peoples of the region described as Witiko possession. Over the following 2 centuries, traders, missionaries, and colonial officials filed dozens of additional accounts. The Hudson's Bay Company kept records. The Jesuits kept records. The patterns they documented are consistent with each other and with the oral tradition as maintained by Cree communities to the present day. By the early 20th century, Western psychiatry had given the phenomenon a clinical name: Wendigo psychosis. The definition: a culture-bound syndrome characterized by cannibalistic delusions, social withdrawal, violent dreams, and compulsive craving for human flesh independent of genuine starvation, was documented in clinical literature and retroactively applied to historical cases. Whether the syndrome represents a genuine psychiatric disorder, a culturally specific expression of psychosis triggered by extreme isolation, or something else entirely remains disputed in the academic literature. In 1982, anthropologist Lou Marano published a paper arguing that true Wendigo psychosis cases had never existed, that what the record documented was a community system for identifying and eliminating dangerous individuals before they caused harm. The debate has not been resolved. What is not disputed is the following. In communities living in severe, chronic winter isolation in the boreal forest of northern Canada, people sometimes develop symptoms consistent with the Witiko description. Some of those people killed and ate other people. The killing happened close enough to the early records of Canadian law enforcement that courts and newspapers had to figure out what to do with it, and the Cree, for the centuries before those courts arrived, had their own system for addressing it. That system required someone who knew what they were doing. In the Sucker clan of the Upper Severn River for most of the second half of the 19th century, that someone was Jack Fiddler. He was born somewhere in the boreal forest near Sandy Lake, Ontario in the 1830s or 1840s. No record from the outside world notes the event because the outside world had not yet reached that part of the forest. His father before him led the Sucker clan through its seasonal rounds along the river system.
His father also served before him as the clan's designated Witiko hunter. The role was not a title in any ceremonial sense. It was a function. When someone in the clan or in a neighboring clan that sought assistance showed signs of Wendigo possession, there was a specific sequence of what the tradition prescribed: observation, community deliberation, an attempt at treatment through ritual intervention, and, if the possession was determined to be advanced and irreversible, execution. The logic was preventive. A person taken fully by the Wendigo would kill members of the community. The execution happened before that could occur. The person performing the execution needed to be someone the community trusted completely and who had the ceremonial knowledge to do it correctly. Jack Fiddler was also known as a healer and a shaman capable of communicating with animals, skills that in the Anishinaabe tradition are not separate from the Wendigo hunting function, but part of the same spiritual competence. He was respected by Cree ministers at Island Lake, who approached him multiple times and asked him to bring Christianity to his people. He heard their requests respectfully and declined. He did not convert. He was also respected by HBC traders and missionaries who had operated near his territory for years, people who had direct experience of the Sandy Lake region, and who in 1907 would publicly defend him. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Sucker Clan under Jack Fiddler was one of the last indigenous groups in all of North America living entirely outside Canadian legal authority. They had never signed a treaty, they had no contact with the government. For most members of the clan, Canadian law was not a distant abstraction, it was simply unknown. Their law was their own, the same law their grandparents had lived under, governing matters of trade, marriage, property, and the specific situations, like Wendigo possession, that their tradition had developed protocols to handle. Jack Fiddler had applied those protocols 14 times by the fall of 1906. His own brother, Peter Flett, was among the people he killed. Flett had turned Wendigo when food ran out on a trading expedition. The record does not describe what that looked like. It only records that the family asked Jack Fiddler to intervene, and that he did. To understand the case of Jack Fiddler, you need to understand what 14 actually means in context.
These were not 14 executions over the course of a long career by a man with unchecked power. The Sucker Clan at this period numbered somewhere around 100 to 120 people. They were an isolated community in a region of chronic resource scarcity, living through multiple generations of famine pressure. The Wendigo cases Jack Fiddler addressed over his lifetime were not evenly distributed. They clustered around periods of extreme winter stress, which is exactly the pattern the tradition predicts and the clinical literature documents. Some of the 14 were different in character from others. A portion were what the tradition classified as externally sent, Wendigo spirits dispatched by enemy shamans against the Sucker Clan, targeting individuals who then began to manifest possession symptoms. These cases were understood as acts of aggression from outside the community, and the response was understood as defense. Other cases involved Sucker Clan members who had developed the internal symptoms, the withdrawal, the nausea at normal food, the progression toward uncontrollable craving, and whose families had determined through community deliberation that the possession was advanced enough to be irreversible. In several documented cases, the person identified as possessed had asked to be executed themselves. This detail appears in multiple accounts and is important because it complicates any straightforward reading of these events as murder. The tradition allowed for, and in some cases, at the request of the individual, required a kind of ritual death as protection against becoming something that would destroy others. Whether that constitutes euthanasia, communal self-defense, or something for which Western legal categories have no adequate term, depends on which framework you are applying. What the tradition also encoded was a system of community accountability that prevented the role from becoming something it wasn't. Jack Fiddler did not act alone. The decision to execute someone identified as Wendigo possessed was not his to make unilaterally. It required deliberation. The family of the affected person had to be consulted, the community elders had to reach a consensus, and the intervention had to be requested rather than imposed. This is documented consistently across multiple accounts of how the Sucker Clan operated. The shaman's function was to perform the execution, not to initiate it.
He was the instrument of a collective decision, not an individual authority operating without check. That structure matters enormously when evaluating what the Canadian court was actually prosecuting in 1907. The charge was murder, The charge assumed a single individual making a lethal decision without authorization. Neither of those assumptions accurately described what happened in any of the 14 cases. Every one of them involved community deliberation. Most of them involved family request. Several involved the request of the person being executed themselves. The Canadian legal system had no category for any of that, no framework for communal authorization of death, no understanding of the ritual and deliberative context in which these killings occurred, and no interest in developing one. The case of Swift Runner in 1879 illustrates what happened when the Sucker Clan system was absent. Swift Runner was a Cree trapper living in what is now central Alberta. During the winter of 1878 and 1879, he killed his wife, his mother, his brother, and 6 of his children, and ate them. He was 25 miles from a Hudson's Bay Company supply post when he did it. He was not dying of starvation. He confessed to the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, was tried in Fort Saskatchewan in August 1879, and was hanged on December 20th, the first legal execution in Alberta. Before the trapdoor dropped, he gave a short speech. He did not dispute what he had done. He said he had been possessed by a Wendigo. The court sentenced him as a murderer. Jack Fiddler's argument for the rest of his life was that what he did prevented Swift Runner from happening to the people in his care. It was not a claim he made defensively, it was a statement of what he understood his function to be, and it was an argument the court in 1907 never engaged with, not because it lacked merit, but because engaging with it would have required taking seriously the question of whether the Sucker Clan system worked. That question was never put to the court. The court was only asked whether Canadian law had been broken. The fall of 1906, the Sucker Clan was in their seasonal camp. A woman named Wasakepikwi was gravely ill. She was the daughter-in-law of Joseph Fiddler, the wife of Joseph's son, which made her also a member of the extended Fiddler family. Whatever her illness was, Jack Fiddler determined that it had crossed the threshold.
The community deliberated. The conclusion was reached. Jack and Joseph Fiddler strangled Wasakepikwi with a piece of string. It was the 14th time. The method was consistent with the tradition's prescribed approach, quick, close, performed by the designated individual with ceremonial knowledge. There was no struggle recorded in any account, which is consistent either with the woman being deeply incapacitated by illness or with accounts suggesting she had in some form consented to what was happening to her. No contemporary record resolves this with certainty. What made this case different from the previous 13 was not the act itself, it was geography and timing. The fur trade had pushed certain Cree men further into contact with Canadian infrastructure. Norman Ray, whose wife was a member of the Sucker people, had connections that extended to Island Lake, where Canadian institutions, missionaries, HBC traders, and occasionally police were no longer entirely absent. Word reached the wrong ears. In early 1907, it reached a specific set of ears belonging to 2 members of the Northwest Mounted Police. The record notes what those officers heard, filtered through the language of the report they wrote. A band of pagan Indians living in the bush who were in the habit of killing one another whenever one became delirious with fever. That was not entirely accurate as a description of what Jack Fiddler had been doing. But it was accurate enough to generate an investigation, and the investigation would generate a march into the boreal forest that had never happened before, along a route that the mounted police had never traveled, toward a community that had never been subject to any law but its own. On March 16, 1907, Constable J.A.W. O'Neill left Island Lake on a dog sled. He was heading towards Sandy Lake, which required traveling through terrain that left no trail, in weather that required the specific knowledge Jack Fiddler's people had spent generations acquiring. O'Neill made the journey anyway. By April, he had been joined by Constable Cashman, sent from Norway House to assist in what had become a formal investigation. As they approached the Sucker Clan's territory, they learned from Norman Ray the name of the man they were going to see and what he was known for. They continued to Caribou Lake, also called Deer Lake, where the clan's camp was located. They arrived on June 15, 1907.
For most of the Sucker people, these were the first white men they had ever seen. Jack Fiddler welcomed them with open arms. The oral accounts preserved by the clan describe the reception as genuinely hospitable. The Sucker people were not a hostile community, and their isolation had not made them suspicious of strangers. The Mounties were fed and housed. The atmosphere of the visit shifted when the constables explained why they had come. Jack Fiddler refused to go, not out of panic, not out of guilt. He refused on a point of principle. What they had done in their community, he said, had nothing to do with the laws of the Canadians. This was not a legal argument in the Western sense. It was a statement of fact as he understood it. The Sucker clan had their own law. The Mounties represented a different law that had not previously applied to these people, and that Jack Fiddler saw no reason to accept as having authority over decisions made within his community for his community's protection. The Mounties arrested both brothers anyway. They were taken north to Norway House under restraint, hundreds of miles from their home, from their people, and from any territory they had ever moved through voluntarily. They were held there to await trial. By August, the newspapers had the story. The Toronto Globe ran the headline, "Dark Deeds of Keewatin Indians. They strangle and burn sick friends." Across Canada, the public read about devil worship in the northern forests. The demand for conviction was immediate and loud. The officers conducting the case saw in it, according to later accounts, an opportunity for professional advancement. The people who actually knew the Sandy Lake region, the HBC traders who had operated near the Sucker clan for years, the missionaries who had met Jack Fiddler and been declined politely, said something different. They submitted statements, they testified to what they had witnessed. They described a man who had performed a community function that their tradition required and that their tradition had authorized. Nobody in a position of authority listened. More than 100 days had passed since the arrest. Jack Fiddler was old enough that the constables at Norway House seemed to have stopped treating his supervision as a serious concern. He was a small, elderly man far from home who had never once attempted to escape or to resist in any way that warranted special attention.
He had made no dramatic declarations. He had simply waited with what the accounts describe as a consistent and untroubled composure in a situation that must have been incomprehensible to him in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence. On the morning of September 30th, the prisoners were walked to the riverbank to build fires and prepare breakfast. The constable on duty, Arthur Wilkins, decided the old man among them did not require close watching. Jack Fiddler saw the gap between Wilkins and himself, and he moved into it, not running, not urgently, but walking. The accounts say he simply walked toward the tree line and entered the bush. He was found later the same day. His sash was tied in a loose slip knot around a branch. The other end was around his neck. He was lying on a rock. His body was brought back to the barracks, placed in a coffin filled with salt to preserve it, and retained by the Canadian authorities. He was never tried. Joseph Fiddler remained. He stood trial alone, without legal representation. The eyewitness, Angus Ray, testified that Wasakapiki had been killed while in deep pain and incurably sick. According to customs the Sucker people had followed without any knowledge of Canadian law. Joseph Fiddler, when asked to speak on his own behalf, said, "I did not know what I was doing was wrong, and if I had known, I would not have done the deed." Commissioner Aylesworth Perry rejected that defense. The ruling he issued has been quoted in every account of this case since. What the law forbids, no pagan belief can justify. Joseph was sentenced to hang at noon on January 7, 1908. He was taken to Stony Mountain Penitentiary. He was old and sick and spent most of his imprisonment in the hospital ward. A subsequent appeal, filed by parties who had followed the case and believed the conviction was unjust, was eventually approved. The order authorizing Joseph Fiddler's release arrived at the prison 3 days after he died. The year was 1909. This is the only recorded trial of its kind in Canadian legal history. There are several frameworks available for understanding what happened to the Fiddlers and to the community they protected, and they are not all equally supported.
but they are also not mutually exclusive. The colonial jurisdiction argument is the most straightforward and the most documented.
The Sucker Clan was the last indigenous group in North America living entirely outside Canadian legal authority. The Fiddler arrest was, explicitly, an exercise in extending that authority, not a response to a specific crime so much as an assertion of reach. The Mounties who went to Sandy Lake were, by the accounts of those who knew the region, doing something that served the institutional interest of the Canadian government more than the interests of any person in the Boreal Forest. The 1907 trial was Canadian law's first contact with the Cree of Sandy Lake. It was used to establish the principle that Indigenous community law did not override Canadian criminal law, regardless of context. The psychiatric framework requires engaging with the question of whether Wetiko possession, in whatever form it actually took in these communities, was a real phenomenon that required real intervention. Here the record is more complicated than either side of the debate usually acknowledges. The Wendigo psychosis literature documents a consistent cluster of symptoms appearing in boreal communities under conditions of severe winter stress, appearing in accounts from multiple independent sources over 2 centuries, vanishing from the record when those communities made sustained contact with sedentary civilization. Lou Morano's 1982 argument that the syndrome was an artifact of anthropological misreading, a system for identifying and eliminating dangerous individuals rather than a genuine psychiatric condition, is compelling in some respects. It is less compelling when applied to the Swift Runner case, where a man with access to food killed and ate his family and explained, clearly and without coercion, that a Wetiko had made him do it. Morano's broader reframing is worth sitting with, though. His argument was not that nothing happened, it was that the question had been asked wrong. Western anthropologists, he said, imported a clinical framework onto a social system, and what they called a disorder was actually a mechanism. They looked for the individual pathology and missed the community function. The Sucker Clan's practice under that reading was not a response to a supernatural phenomenon. It was a community's rational method for managing the psychological and social ruptures caused by extreme chronic stress. A person who stopped eating, withdrew from community life, began expressing violent ideation. That person, in a community of 100 people living through a 6-month winter with depleted food supplies, was a genuine threat regardless of what caused their breakdown. The execution prevented the breakdown from becoming catastrophic. The Wetiko cosmology gave it meaning and ritual legitimacy. What the record does not support is the comfortable conclusion that Jack Fiddler was simply a murderer who constructed a supernatural justification for his actions. That reading requires ignoring the community context, the family deliberations, the cases of individuals who requested their own execution, the 2 centuries of parallel documentation, and the fact that the people who knew the Sandy Lake region best, and who had no reason to protect Jack Fiddler, defended him publicly during the trial. It also requires ignoring that the Sucker Clan, in all the years Jack Fiddler served as their Wetiko hunter, never experienced a Swift Runner event. The question the case actually forces is one the Canadian legal system in 1907 was not equipped to ask and showed no interest in asking. What was Jack Fiddler actually responding to? Not in the metaphysical sense, though that question is also available, but in the practical one. The Sucker Clan lived in conditions that the clinical literature identifies as the precise conditions under which Wetiko-type breakdowns occurred in other communities. They had a designated function for addressing those breakdowns. The function was performed by a man with decades of experience and community authorization. The function appears to have worked. None of that is what the Toronto Globe asked its readers to consider in August 1907. None of it is what Commissioner Perry considered when he ruled that no pagan belief could justify what the law forbids. The boreal forest of northwestern Ontario is still there. It didn't change because a trial happened in Norway House in 1907. The spruce and tamarack along the upper Severn River are not aware that the Sucker Clan was brought for the first time under a legal system they had never known. The winters there still last 5 or 6 months. The temperature still drops past the point where most people have a reference for what cold means. The Cree and Ojibwe communities of the Sandy Lake region are still there too. The tradition of the Wetiko, not the version with the antlered skull, but the older one, the one that describes what isolation and hunger and a particular kind of winter darkness can unlock in a person, is still transmitted between generations. The knowledge is not archaeological, it is active. Elders still teach it to young people as a framework for understanding what the forest requires of those who live in it seriously, and what it does to those who are not prepared. The Wetiko cases in the historical record vanish almost entirely after the early 20th century. The pattern is specific enough to be meaningful, as northern indigenous communities made sustained contact with settled Canadian society. As the conditions of total winter isolation became less absolute, the Wetiko stops appearing in the documentation. Whether that means the disorder resolved because the ecological conditions that produced it changed, or whether it means the community system that would have identified and recorded such cases was dismantled by colonization, is a question the academic literature has not settled. Jack Fiddler never said he was wrong. He admitted the killing without hesitation, described it as a function of his role in the community, and refused, until the moment he walked into the trees, to accept that any authority outside the Sucker clan had standing to judge it. He died before trial on his own terms, in the bush, in a manner he chose, which is perhaps the only kind of resolution available to a man in his position. His brother Joseph's pardon arrived 3 days after Joseph died. The boreal forest is 1.4 billion acres. Sandy Lake is still there. The 5 clans of the Upper Severn are the descendants of the people who weathered the winters that produced the Wetiko, who developed a system for surviving what the forest could do to a person, who watched that system be dismantled by a legal order that arrived in June 1907 and never asked what it was replacing. Jack Fiddler claimed to have killed 14 Wendigos in his lifetime. The Canadian government called it murder. The people he protected called it something else. The forest where he did it has not offered an opinion, and the forest was there before any of the rest of it, and the forest will be there after. The Wetiko, in the tradition that has carried the concept for thousands of years, does not require belief to function. It requires the right conditions. And the conditions, in the right winter, in the right forest, with the right kind of isolation pressing in from every direction, have not gone anywhere. Neither has what Jack Fiddler said he was protecting his people from.